In just 3 days, Bigfoot has kidnapped 8 hunters in Ohio, and the horrifying evidence makes this situation the worst the state has ever seen. The way these hunters got kidnapped by the Sasquatch is more brutal than ever, and what Bigfoot did to them has kept me up at night ever since I've seen the evidence. The first sound on the recording is a ladder rung creaking under weight that shouldn't be there. It's 5:48 in the morning, pitch black in the hollow below the North Ridge, and a bow hunter 30 feet up in a white oak whispers 4 words into his phone before the line goes dead. Something just shook my ladder. That's where this starts. Not with a missing person report, not with a worried wife calling the sheriff's department. It starts with a recording, and it starts with Bigfoot already in the tree. Recovery teams first found a 300-pound rated steel tree stand folded nearly 90 degrees, with its mounting bolt still embedded in the tree, indicating immense force consistent with the alleged Bigfoot encounter. 2 experienced hunters had been positioned about 80 yards apart, overlooking a shared clearing. Investigators concluded the attack came from above, not the ground, based on stripped bark and long, straight gouges on thick branches, suggesting a large creature had moved through the canopy before the hunters arrived. The first hunter's safety harness was recovered, still clipped to the tree, hanging empty, swaying when the wind caught it, according to the man who found it. The chest strap had been severed in a single clean line, not chewed, not torn through fibers the way an animal bite would leave frayed, ragged edges. A single cut, straight across, like a blade had passed through it once and never come back. Whatever did that had either a tool or something close enough to a tool that the difference doesn't matter anymore. That's the detail that should bother you the most. Bigfoot isn't supposed to use tools. Bigfoot is supposed to be an animal, however strange, however cryptid, however folkloric. An animal that cuts a nylon strap in one motion isn't behaving like an animal. It's behaving like something that understands what a harness is for and how to defeat it. Now, the second hunter's stand told a different but equally disturbing story. His ladder sections were separated and stacked at the base of the tree, almost neatly, the rungs aligned. If you didn't know better, you'd think a maintenance crew had disassembled it for storage. But the bolts were sheared off, not unscrewed, the threads stripped raw, meaning whatever pulled that ladder apart did it with brute force, and then, for reasons nobody on the recovery team could explain, took the time to stack the pieces. That's not chaos, that's behavior. That's something that finishes a task and then organizes the aftermath, the same way you'd clean up after yourself. Both men's bows were gone from their stands, but their arrows turned up 300 yards east, in a shallow depression near a fallen log. All of them snapped clean in half at roughly the same point along the shaft and stacked, not scattered by wind, not dragged by scavengers. Stacked, the broken halves laid parallel to each other like kindling arranged for a fire that never got lit. I've gone back and forth on what that means, and I keep landing in the same place. This wasn't an animal destroying a threat. This was Bigfoot disarming 2 men and then keeping a tally of what it took from them. There was no blood at either tree. None on the bark, none on the forest floor, none on the recovered gear. No drag marks leading away through the underbrush, which on its own should tell you how strange this is, because a body weighing 180 or 200 pounds doesn't just vanish without leaving a furrow in the leaf litter, a broken branch, a scuff mark, something. 2 grown men disappeared from 2 separate trees and left behind nothing but bent steel, a severed strap, and a stack of broken arrows. The tracks were the last piece, and they're the piece that convinced the search coordinator to call in outside help. Beneath both oaks, investigators found a single continuous trail of footprints, each one around 17 inches long, the stride consistent, circling both trees for what the depth and freshness of the impressions suggested was hours. Hours of pacing, hours of waiting. Whatever attacked these 2 men wasn't reacting to a surprise encounter. It had positioned itself in the canopy, climbed down at intervals to circle the bases of both trees, checked the terrain, and then climbed back up to wait for first light. That's premeditation. That's a hunting strategy executed against hunters, and it's only the first of 6. There's one more detail from that first scene that didn't make it into the initial report, and I only learned about it after talking to a member of the recovery crew directly. About 40 feet from the base of the second oak, half buried under a drift of fallen leaves, they found a third object that didn't belong to either hunter. A broadhead, the kind used on a hunting arrow, but bent completely in half at the ferrule. The steel folded over on itself like it had been pinched between 2 fingers the size of bricks. No shaft attached, no fletching, just the metal tip, twisted and discarded as if Bigfoot had examined it, tested it, found it unimpressive, and thrown it aside before moving on to whatever came next. That single bent broadhead, sitting alone in the leaves 40 feet from the nearest tree, tells you something about the scale of strength involved here that the bent ladder and the severed strap only hint at. A grown man can't bend hardened broadhead steel with his bare hands. Whatever did this barely had to try. If those first two disappearances sound impossible, keep watching, because the cops hadn't even finished snapping their scouting before Bigfoot took victim number 3. By mid-morning that same day, while search teams were still cataloging the bent tree stands, a third hunter set out solo along a dry creek bed about 2 miles south, following a fresh deer trail he'd scouted the week before. He had a trail camera mounted on a sycamore near a bend in the creek, the kind that triggers on motion and timestamps every frame. When that camera was recovered, it held one image that the search team passed around for days before anyone outside law enforcement saw it. A single frame, daylight, sharp focus, a massive dark shape crouched low behind a boulder no more than 40 feet from the camera, head turned toward the creek bed, watching. The timestamp put it 11 minutes before this hunter's last known GPS ping. Bigfoot had been stationed behind that rock, waiting for him to walk into range. The same patient positioning as the tree stand attack, just executed on the ground instead of in the canopy. His boot prints tell the story of a man who knew something was wrong before he could explain why. Investigators traced his path along the creek bed for nearly a mile, and the pattern is unmistakable once you see it laid out on a map. Long, even strides for a stretch, then a sudden stop, a half turn, a pause, then movement again. Over and over. He kept hearing something behind him and kept second-guessing himself, the way anyone would when the woods go quiet. In that specific way, they go quiet when something large is moving through them. The shadowing here lasted the better part of an hour, Bigfoot staying just outside his peripheral vision, matching his pace, letting him almost see it, and then melting back before he could turn fast enough. His rifle was found jammed barrel down into the creek mud about 60 yards past where the tracking pattern ended. The stock pointed skyward at an angle that only makes sense if he dropped it suddenly while looking up. The trigger guard was bent inward, crushed against the trigger itself hard enough that even if he'd recovered the weapon in that final second, it would have been useless. No shot was fired. No spent casing was found anywhere along that creek bed. His backpack turned up 50 yards downstream, wedged between two rocks, every zipper torn open from the outside, contents scattered across the gravel bar. A multi-tool, a length of paracord, a half-eaten energy bar still in its wrapper, all flung in different directions like the bag had been shaken and emptied rather than methodically searched. But one item from that pack stopped the recovery team cold. His water bottle, a hard plastic container that should have taken serious force to deform, was crushed nearly flat, and pressed into the crushed plastic was a single handprint, fingers and palm, both visible in the deformation, easily twice the width of an adult man's hand. The last physical trace of him was a single footprint pressed deep into the creek mud, 18 inches from heel to toe, far larger than the trail he'd been laying down himself. His own. Boot prints simply stopped at that mark. There was no struggle pattern, no skid marks from a falling body, and no sign he turned to fight or run. The stride pattern shows he was moving forward at a normal hunting pace, and then his prints just end, replaced by that single massive track as if Bigfoot had been pacing him from behind the whole time, finally closed the gap and took him mid-stride before he ever knew the distance had closed. No body and no blood, just an 18-inch print where a man used to be standing. Investigators also found, about 100 yards upstream, a 3-foot wide circle of disturbed gravel with a large footprint at its center, suggesting the alleged Bigfoot had remained there for an extended period before the victim arrived. The scene led investigators to theorize that the creature may have been waiting near the creek, making it one of the few pieces of evidence suggesting it had deliberately remained in one location rather than simply reacting to someone entering the area. That was Hunter 3. Hunter 4 came after dark, and what happened to him is far worse, because it happened in a way that is far darker than the 3 hunters you just heard about. He was camping alone at the base of a limestone cliff about 3 miles from where the creek bed search was still ongoing, planning to hunt the ridge above at first light. His tent was a freestanding dome, aluminum poles, the kind that's supposed to hold up against heavy wind and rain. When it was found the next morning, it was collapsed flat, the poles bent into a uniform U-shape, as if something had simply lowered its full weight onto the center of the structure and held it there. Not stomped, not torn through, sat on or knelt on with enough mass to flatten aluminum tent poles without snapping them outright. But the detail that's haunted the investigators more than the collapsed tent is what happened to the sleeping bag inside it. The zipper had been worked from the outside, pulled down along its track the way a person opens a sleeping bag to check on someone, not the way an animal claws through fabric to get at what's inside. The zipper pull itself had snapped off at the very end of that motion, like whatever opened it pulled just slightly too hard at the last few inches. This man's tent wasn't torn into. It was unzipped, calmly, deliberately, by something that understood exactly how a zipper works. His headlamp turned up a few feet from the collapsed tent, still switched on, the battery fully drained by the time it was found. The beam locked in a position pointing straight up at the cliff face above the campsite. That detail lines up with something else investigators found when they searched the rock above. Fresh scratches gouged into the limestone, deep parallel grooves running diagonally up the cliff face, the kind of marks left by something climbing a near-vertical surface using its fingers and toes for purchase. Bigfoot hadn't approached this campsite from the tree line. It had been clinging to the cliff above the tent, watching him through the dark before it ever came down. His hunting knife, a fixed blade with a 4-inch edge, was found 10 feet from the tent. The blade snapped clean in half at the midpoint. That's not a knife that failed from age or stress. That's a knife that connected with something solid enough to break it on a single swing, which means at some point in those last moments, this man got one defensive strike in before everything went wrong. The tent floor itself, once investigators peeled back the collapsed fabric, showed a single massive depression pressed into the dirt beneath it, roughly the size and shape of a kneeling joint, deep enough to suggest hundreds of pounds bearing down on that one spot. That's where Bigfoot pinned him. And then there are the boots. His hiking boots were found outside the tent, not kicked off in a struggle, not scattered, but placed side by side at the foot of the collapsed dome, laces cut clean and lying neatly across the toes. That detail keeps coming up in this case. The laces, the careful placement, and every time investigators bring it up, they use the same word: ritualistic. Animals don't arrange footwear. Whatever is doing this is leaving a signature, the way a person leaves a signature, and that signature has now shown up at 3 separate scenes in less than 24 hours. No blood, no body, just a flattened tent, a broken knife, and 2 boots set neatly side by side at the edge of the wreckage. Near the tree line, investigators found a lean-to-like structure made from deliberately snapped and stacked branches beside a fallen log. Although no additional evidence was found inside, its construction suggested purposeful behavior. Investigators theorized it may have served as a concealed observation point before the alleged Bigfoot approached the campsite, adding to a pattern of possible pre-positioning seen in other incidents. It's unbelievable how 3 men were already gone. However, as search crews believed daylight would finally tip the odds back in their favor, they were absolutely wrong, as Bigfoot would take another victim. By the second morning, the search had grown into something much larger, with trucks and ATVs staged along every logging road that fed into the forest. One hunter chose not to walk in at all. He parked his pickup at the dead end of a logging spur, intending to glass the far ridge from inside the cab before deciding whether conditions were safe enough to get out. He never got the chance to make that decision for himself. His truck was found with all 4 doors dented inward, the metal pressed in toward the cab as if something had wrapped its weight against the frame from the outside and squeezed. The windshield was pushed inward from the exterior side, a dense spiderweb of cracks radiating from a central point. But the glass hadn't given way entirely, meaning whatever struck it hit hard enough to deform safety glass without shattering it through. His rifle was still on the passenger seat, magazine loaded, safety off, never fired. This is the incident where the stalking turns psychological instead of just physical, and the tire tracks prove it. This man tried to escape. The tracks behind his truck show a reverse maneuver, tires cutting hard through the gravel, an attempt to back out of the spur road and get clear. But he couldn't, because boulders had been rolled across the road behind him sometime in the preceding hours, blocking the only way out. Not fallen boulders, rolled. Investigators found drag furrows in the dirt leading from a slope above the road down to where the rocks now sat, evidence that something had physically moved them into place to seal off his exit before he ever realized he needed one. His cell phone was recovered from the floorboard on the driver's side, camera app still open, battery dead. The last photo on that device is blurred, taken in a hurry, but clear enough to make out matted black fur filling most of the frame and, just at the edge, a single dark eye catching the light. He saw it coming for him through the windshield, raised his phone, and got one frame off before whatever happened next happened. The driver's side door handle was torn completely off the truck, the metal twisted and deformed like soft taffy, evidence of a grip strength that doesn't belong to anything that's supposed to exist in an Ohio forest. There was no blood found anywhere inside the cab, but the roof of the truck told its own story, a massive dent pressed down into the sheet metal directly above the driver's seat, the kind of impact you'd expect from something heavy landing on it from a height, not climbing onto it from the ground. His boots, again, were found on the roadside near the rear bumper, placed neatly, laces tied together this time instead of cut. Bigfoot didn't come through the door. It came down from above, onto the roof of his own truck and took him from there. The bed of that pickup held one more answer no one expected to find. A spare tire, normally bolted beneath the truck frame, had been pulled loose and thrown nearly 30 feet into the brush alongside the road. The steel mounting bracket bent and torn away in the process. Investigators initially assumed it had been knocked loose during whatever struggle happened at the cab, but the angle of the throw and the distance involved told a different story once they mapped it out. Something had reached underneath that truck, ripped the spare free, and discarded it like an obstacle in the way of something it wanted, possibly testing whether there was anything useful or threatening stored beneath the vehicle before it ever moved to the cab itself. That level of methodical searching, checking under a truck the same way it had checked through a backpack at the creek bed, fits the same pattern that's been building since the very first tree stand. Bigfoot isn't simply attacking, it's investigating, taking inventory of everything these men carried before it ever takes the men themselves. That makes 4 men gone in under 2 days, and the search effort that followed was the largest the region had mounted in years. Now the truck proved Bigfoot could trap a man without ever touching the forest. However, the next attack showed it didn't even need the element of surprise anymore. 2 more hunters, brothers who'd grown up hiking these ridges together, volunteered to walk the high ground at dusk on the second evening, covering a section of ridgeline that hadn't yet been cleared. Their GPS units, recovered later, show something the search coordinator described as immediately alarming once he saw the data plotted out. The pace of their movement along that ridge was far too fast for a casual evening hunt. These men were running. The audio recovered from one brother's phone captures the moment everything changed. He's breathing hard, the kind of breathing that comes from sprinting uphill, and he shouts to his brother that it's pacing them in the tree line. Then there's a stretch of heavy breathing, branches snapping somewhere off to the side, and then nothing. The recording cuts to silence. What the reconstruction team pieced together from the ground sign paints this as the most aggressive of all 6 incidents, a deliberate chase rather than an ambush. Bigfoot ran parallel to the 2 brothers for nearly half a mile, crashing through saplings and undergrowth as it moved, the broken vegetation forming a visible corridor through the brush that investigators were able to walk and photograph the next day. It wasn't trying to catch them in a straight line. It was herding them, pushing them off the ridge trail and toward a dead-end overlook where the terrain dropped away into a sheer drop of close to 60 feet. Their boot prints show both men stopping hard at the cliff edge, spinning to face the tree line they'd just come from, and opening fire. Investigators recovered 6 spent shotgun shell casings at that overlook, all of them aimed back toward the tree line, which tells you these men believed the threat was still in front of them, still on the ground, still approaching from the direction they'd been running from. But the branches in the canopy directly above that overlook were snapped and broken in a pattern that only makes sense if something had circled wide through the treetops and come down on them from above while they were focused on the ground-level threat they thought they were facing. Their shotguns were eventually found at the base of the cliff, the barrels bent into hooked shapes, twisted with a force that no fall from 60 feet could account for on its own, not without something actively crushing the steel afterward. There was no blood at the top of the overlook, despite 6 rounds having been fired from that exact spot. But at the bottom of the cliff, where 2 falling bodies should have left some trace, some impact pattern in the rock and brush below, there was nothing. No bodies, no blood, just 2 more pairs of boots, set side by side near the base of the rock face, laces tied in the same careful manner as the previous scene. The conclusion the recovery team reached, however uncomfortable, is that Bigfoot either caught both men mid-fall or seized them before they ever went over the edge, because something that size landing at the base of that cliff should have left a crater of disturbed gravel and broken brush, and instead the ground there was undisturbed. What makes this incident stand apart from the previous four is the sheer aggression of it, the willingness to be heard, to crash through saplings loud enough that both brothers knew exactly where the threat was coming from at every point during that half-mile chase. Every other incident in this account involved stealth, patience, ambush. This one involved a deliberate, noisy pursuit, as if Bigfoot had grown bolder with each successful incident, no longer needing to hide its approach because it had already learned that hiding wasn't necessary. Investigators found one more unsettling detail near the start of that chase corridor, close to where the brothers' GPS pings first show them breaking into a run. A series of 3 trees, each about 6 inches in diameter, snapped off at chest height within feet of each other, the broken trunks all leaning in the same direction, away from the ridge trail and toward the dead-end overlook. Bigfoot hadn't just chased these men toward that cliff. It had cleared a path toward it beforehand, breaking down anything that might have given them an alternate route to escape through the brush, funneling them toward the one place they had nowhere left to run. Get this. 6 hunters gone by the start of the 3rd day. And if you think Bigfoot is done, think again, because the Sasquatch is about to make that 8. He was the search guide, the man who'd organized volunteer teams since the first hunter went missing, armed, experienced, carrying a .44 Magnum revolver that he'd used on dangerous game before. On the 3rd day, while leading a search party along the base of the ridge, he split off from the group to check a limestone cave mouth that one of the dogs had alerted on, telling the others he'd circle back within 20 minutes. He never did. His revolver was found just inside the cave entrance. Cylinder swung open, all 6 rounds still loaded and unfired. He never got a shot off, despite being the most prepared man in this entire account, despite knowing what had already happened to 6 other hunters, despite carrying a weapon built to stop something massive. His flashlight was recovered deeper inside the cave, still switched on when found. The beam locked onto the back wall, illuminating something investigators almost missed in their first pass through. Bigfoot made 5 deep grooves gouged into the limestone, spaced apart in a pattern consistent with a massive hand, pressed flat against the rock and then dragged downward, fingers splayed. The stalking in this final incident reads as the most intimate of the entire sequence. His boot prints inside the cave show him walking backward, deeper into the dark, the whole time facing the entrance behind him, never turning his back on whatever was following. That's a man who knew something was behind him and refused to stop watching it, retreating step by careful step into a cave that only had one way out. His backpack was found shredded near the cave mouth, contents pulled out and scattered across the entrance floor as if searched piece by piece rather than simply torn apart. His radio sat on the cave floor a short distance in, still transmitting static when the search party finally found it. The channel left open the entire time, broadcasting nothing but silence and the faint sound of dripping water back to base camp for hours. But it's what investigators found at the very back of the cave that has stayed with everyone involved in this case longer than anything else recovered across all 6 incidents. Sitting on a flat shelf of rock at the rear wall, beneath those Bigfoot's 5-clawed grooves, was his lighter, still flickering when it was discovered, the flame somehow still alive despite the hours that had passed. And laid across that rock right beside it, deliberately placed, was a single unbroken arrow, intact from nock to broadhead, identical in fletching and shaft markings to the arrows recovered from the very first incident 3 days earlier on the North Ridge. Bigfoot had carried that arrow from the first attack site, across miles of forest, through 2 more days and 4 more incidents, and set it down at the back of this cave like an offering left for whoever came looking. That single detail reframes everything that came before it. This was never a string of random encounters. This was a collection being assembled, trophy by trophy, scene by scene, and the cave was where it had been keeping them. The cave walls around that back chamber showed multiple handprints pressed into a thin layer of mineral dust, all of them at roughly 9 feet off the cave floor, all of them oriented to face the entrance, as if Bigfoot had stood there in the dark, hand braced against the stone, watching the cave mouth and waiting for the guide to walk all the way in before it ever moved. No body was found. No blood was found. Just a guide's revolver with 6 unfired rounds, a flickering lighter, a single arrow laid across a rock, like a marker, and the smell of rot drifting out from somewhere deeper in the limestone that no one on the search team was willing to follow any farther that day. Before they pulled back from that rear chamber, 2 members of the search party swept their flashlights along the upper edges of the cave ceiling, more out of instinct than procedure, and caught sight of something neither of them expected: a narrow fissure, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Sideways, ran upward from the back corner of the chamber, disappearing into total darkness beyond the reach of their beams. Loose stone dust along the lower lip of that fissure had been disturbed recently, smeared in a pattern consistent with something large pulling itself up and through the gap rather than walking. That fissure has never been fully explored. The geological survey that followed weeks later determined it connects to a second, smaller chamber, roughly 18 feet above the one where the guide's revolver was found, a space too tight for standard search equipment and too unstable to risk sending anyone through without specialized gear. Whatever used that gap to leave the cave did so by folding itself through an opening that should have been too narrow for something its size, the same way it folded steel tree stands and crushed plastic water bottles, treating the limits of the physical world as something flexible rather than fixed. 8 hunters across 3 days, 6 separate incidents, and a pattern that only gets clearer the more of this evidence you lay side by side. Bent steel at the tree stands, a severed strap cut in one motion, a trail camera frame of something crouched and waiting behind a boulder, a crushed water bottle with a handprint twice the size of a man's, a tent zipper worked open from the outside, a knife snapped in a single swing, a truck roof caved in from above, 6 shotgun shells fired at a threat that came from the wrong direction entirely, and at the very end, in the back of a limestone cave, an arrow carried 3 days and 3 miles, set down deliberately beside a still burning lighter, like Bigfoot wanted whoever found it to know exactly what had been collected and exactly who was responsible. Now I laid all 6 GPS points over the satellite map. They form a straight line, exactly 2 miles long. A logging road permit was approved for that corridor the week before the first attack. The creature didn't wander into these hunters, it patrolled them. Each incident happened at a different choke point along that line: the oaks, the creek bed, the cliff base, the logging spur, the ridge line, the cave. It was systematically removing anyone who entered that corridor, one group at a time. The crushed bottles, the bent bows, the cut harnesses, the arranged boots, all of it points to a creature that doesn't kill for food. It kills for territory. Bigfoot did this, and it's not finished.